Good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you very much for taking the time to come and see my presentation. I'm Tim Orchard. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Sidea. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about quantifying AI cyber risk. I thought, what better to talk about at a risk conference than probably one of the number one topics on most businesses' mind at the moment in terms of what to do with it, how to get the best out of it, and most importantly, how to make sure you do that securely. Before I kind of dive into the kind of main content, just a little quick segue about who Sidea are. So we're exhibiting over there if you want to know more, but basically we are a information security, cyber security consultancy and solutions business that's all about helping our clients make better cyber security decisions. One of the kind of main principles that we kind of hold quite dear is to kind of have a completely opposite view of a lot of the kind of way that people talk about cybersecurity and get traction to do something about it. There's no fear, uncertainty, and doubt in our pitches. What we're trying to do is find sensible, data-driven, quantified ways to help businesses make the right balanced decision to identify and do something about cyber risks or not. It's perfectly acceptable to take a level of risk. I'm sure talking to a room of practitioners on risk, you will understand that as well. So it's a little bit about Sidea. But anyway, on with the content of the day. So, most of this presentation is kind of born out of conversations that we've had with our clients, users of our cyber risk management platform. And I'm just going to kind of set the scene a little bit about, is AI cyber risk a problem already? Have we got evidence in the world? And just kind of pick a few points around that. Talk very briefly about governance and what good governance might need to look like, and then very quickly segue into some of the main areas of AI risk that we've seen from a cybersecurity perspective. And this is a pure cyber-focused talk. There are lots of other risks of using AI that are not cyber-specific. And then kind of the kind of point of what I want to get to is not only, what are the areas of risk that you may break down or consolidate, but also how might you think about them from a quantitative perspective to kind of get your hand around, should we be doing something about this? How does it rank amongst our other risks? And kind of end up with a bit of a work scenario to hopefully make you be a little bit of a believer in the quantification approach to cyber risk by the end of it. Or challenge me otherwise, because I'm quite happy with that as well. It's totally fine. So firstly, are AI cyber incidents real? It's a bit of an obvious thing, but helpfully IBM did a very good job of kind of covering some of the different dimensions of cyber risks that we're seeing out there at the moment in their current report. So plug to IBM for some good research. I think the points I want to make against this, AI is a problem. It's in the news, and I've got some topical news arguments to kind of back up some of the areas that I think. This is a multi-dimensional problem. On one hand, you're talking about AI being used to facilitate cyber attacks. Is that an increased risk or a different risk? On another hand, you're talking about AI and misuse of AI allowing data to leak out of your organization. But I think a few common things in here are around organizations just not quite keeping pace with actually the kind of breadth and depth of these kinds of risks, and some kind of quite surprising data points in terms of what this is doing to the average cost of a breach through areas that are facilitated, supported, or leaked or breached because of AI. And I think the common takeaway in the IBM data breach report was that 2/3 of organizations lack the policies and governance around doing something sensible with AI. Again, not a big surprise so far, but I think a really important point. So, from a governance perspective, some of the areas that we've been discussing with clients and helping them on the governance side are about, the kind of ownership, the understanding of what we're doing with AI, making sure that you've got the right policies, what good looks like, what is facilitated for use, rather than things that are not allowed, the kind of shadow AI problem. If you're thinking about all of these things from a governance perspective, great, well done. The purpose of this talk is not quite that, and I could talk about this slide for probably more time than I've got on its own. But I think the point that I want to make is, this is all great, but you really need to understand what you're governing before you really go deep into, how are you going to put some of these things into place? And, our view is when you're looking at any kind of new technology or new way of doing business or anything, you start with understanding what the risks are. working out, do they apply to you? How do you want to break them down? And then how do you want to govern them? And all of this stuff kind of flows through. We're all about, from my perspective, top-down view of this world rather than this is a big problem, let's put a bunch of controls in place and hope that that sorts it out. So what are the areas that I'm going to kind of go into in a bit more detail? So, and these aren't risks, these are categories of risk. There's certainly 4 that I'm going to talk about a bit more within this presentation. Moving a little bit from left to right, AI-driven cyber attack. This is AI being used to facilitate bad guys to attack your organizations. And, this is a multi-dimensional problem, as I'm going to kind of come on to. It's not just AI-facilitated phishing attacks, which clearly is kind of front of mind for a lot of people at the moment. It's also, internal shadow AI data leakage through putting sensitive internal corporate personal information into AI. Another whole category of areas that gets a lot of news coverage at the moment, all the way back to 2022, 2023, when OpenAI kind of first became quite prevalent in most organizations' mind. It's probably been the #1 AI cyber risk that people have been worrying about for a while. Kind of switching to the right, and I'll come back to the last one that's crossed out in a minute, supply chain AI compromise. This is suppliers putting AI into their products in a way that maybe you don't understand, don't even realize, and that being compromised instead. And, pretty much every single software company on the planet at the moment is putting AI into their products. Everybody in your supply chain potentially fits into this kind of risk. Certainly every vendor in this hall today pretty much is putting AI into their products. So there's a whole bunch of risks from that come from that too. Compromise of customer-facing AI. This is the products that you're building being compromised through the AI that's within them. And then lastly, kind of in the middle, AI in your corporate workflow, which, this is one of the kind of things that a lot of our customers were kind of talking to us about. But, in my view, that's kind of covered in the main by a lot of these other categories, whether it's third-party applications, whether it's your applications, whether it's your data leakage. So I'm going to kind of double-click now on these 4 areas and kind of hopefully provide a bit of a frame of reference as to kind of a bit more what are they and what should you be thinking about in terms of quantification of these risks. So the first one, so AI-driven cyber attack. And, I've got a few handy press articles. There's a wealth of cyber breach articles out there at the moment that are pretty fresh over the last 12 to 24 months or so. There's 2 dimensions to this that we've been looking at with our customers. Firstly, there's the one that gets a lot of headlines, deepfake attacks. How many people are kind of aware of the one on the top left where the poor old finance person's on a video call with, I think it was 13 or 15 fictitious people and was coerced through AI deepfakes to give them money. There's AI facilitated phishing. There's a whole bunch of things. AI attack surface discovery tools. Criminals are using that to do an outside-in attack against your organization. The other one that's maybe not getting quite so much press coverage and was harder to find some kind of good, solid examples. I make the point about singularity, and I don't know how many of you are aware of the singularity attack, Shai-Hulud worm. Most people talk about it being a third-party risk through a package management system being compromised. What a lot of people that didn't read all of the detail of the breaches maybe not quite so aware of is that actually the attackers, once they got in, were using internal legitimate AI tools to facilitate the finding of secrets and keys and things like that and exfiltrating them faster. So it was actually speeding up the piece after you've got a foothold to exploit that. So it's not only bad AI tools that you need to worry about, it's how your tools could be used by an attacker, in traditional kind of cyber defense, living off the land, using what you've got there to stay below the radar. This is a classic example of that maybe is a bit of a growing risk as AI becomes both an easy way for your employees to access and find information and do their job. It's also a really easy way for an attacker to work its way through your network and much more quickly find and exfiltrate the data that they're after. When you're thinking about this kind of category, is this one risk? Is this 2 separate risks? Also, maybe I would argue that maybe these aren't separate risks at all. AI-facilitated cyber attack, is it demonstrably different to a traditional cyber attack? Is it making the speed of the attack more prevalent in terms of the data exfiltration one? Is it making the likelihood of it being successful much higher in terms of more sophisticated phishing attacks and non-native English speakers who like to fish English-speaking world to actually do better phishing email consolidation. So, there is no right answer for this. And it's kind of become a common thread, but thinking about these kinds of areas in the context of the risks that you've already got and whether you want to break them down or not, because the impact or the probability of those things happening or what you need to do about addressing it may or may not be different. From a quantitative perspective, standard kind of stuff to think about to quantify the impact of this risk. Is it going to disrupt your business operations where you have to turn things off to while you work out how to fix and remediate them? Are you going to get fined because you're losing PII from the cyber attacks? Will there be a reputational impact? When I've given this talk before, people are like, how do you quantify reputational impact? It's hard to do, but typically if you look at historical evidence about any cyber attack, there will be a dip in sales, there'll be a dip in revenue, there'll be a dip in customer growth. If you're a service company, there'll be an increase in customer churn. These are all solid financial basis that you can maybe use to quantify. And maybe you want to quantify all of those within a specific risk scenario. That's okay as well. So looking at the second one, internal shadow AI data leakage. A couple of examples here to kind of help you kind of frame the point if you're taking this back internally. I've got two here. On one hand, you've got a pretty big healthcare company that was running an internal chatbot as a prototype to kind of help it with a potential future better customer claims handling. That was accidentally put on the internet. Whilst internal private customer data wasn't leaked because it was a prototype, all of the conversations and internal testing around how they would handle claims and when they wouldn't pay out those claims was available on the internet for everybody to kind of capture. And maybe this is again, you've got this already codified in terms of non-AI applications that are misconfigured and exposed to the internet. Maybe you haven't. Maybe this is more critical in terms of the impact that it would have. On the other hand, you've got probably one of the most famous kind of early data leakage worries when people were putting their code from Samsung into ChatGPT saying, help me make it better. And then that code was being used to train the model, leaked to everybody else. So two very different perspectives on internal or shadow AI data leakage. You've probably got your own examples and that kind of thing. Again, are these different risks? Are these part of risks that you've already got? Do you want to break these out separately because you've been asked to look at AI risk in the round and you want to slice horizontally across the kinds of risks that you're looking to manage? These are the questions I'd probably be asking myself when I'm kind of looking at this. And again, quantification, PII, data loss, fines, customer churn, revenue impact. These are the kinds of basis that we would be using with our clients to quantify these kinds of things from an impact perspective. Third, compromise with customer-facing AI. This one is becoming an increasing concern. There's a lot of articles at the moment about people have rushed too quickly to put AI within their products, and they're finding a whole bunch of vulnerabilities. And I've got two kind of quite different examples here. So, Lenovo built a chatbot, which is, most companies are building chatbots for better customer experience. They didn't handle actually some basic application security vulnerabilities within that application, and it was vulnerable to a whole bunch of really well-known application security flaws that were used to compromise it, steal customer data and things like that. So, again, this is AppSec 101, but the pace of implementation of AI and the facilitation that it's got in terms of the information it's got access to, and that's your shop window. Lenovo probably went a bit too fast and maybe could have spent a bit more time considering application security 101 to prevent this kind of breach. On the other hand, Perplexity, which everywhere I go at the moment, people tout this as the best AI browser on the market by a million miles. Even Perplexity are not immune to this kind of thing. Everybody's using it. So, Perplexity themselves fell foul of the fact that their browser actually could be susceptible to commands embedded in the places that it was browsing, giving data to people that it wasn't meant to. Pretty embarrassing from Perplexity, entirely recoverable, and they're not unique in that kind of thing. AI instructional level vulnerabilities versus common web application security vulnerabilities, both maybe because AI implementation in applications is going a little bit faster than the governance that needs to sit around it. And last but not least, that I was going to kind of cover a little bit today is supply chain AI compromise. And, there's a little bit of, which angle do you sit on, whereas this is your applications as the vendor, or this is your supplier's applications. But, as I said at the top of the presentation, pretty much every application provider, especially every SaaS one these days, is embedding AI within their applications, either overtly or behind the scenes in an agentic fashion. A couple of good examples here as to when it's backfired from quite a different perspective to make you think. The first one, pretty straightforward. Salesloft drift was compromised. Zscaler were the victim. Zscaler's customer records were exposed. Kind of quite embarrassing. Standards third-party data breach, but facilitated by AI. On the other hand, it's maybe not quite so straightforward as a third-party data breach, is the reliance on AI to facilitate your workflow. So, most software development companies now are using AI to facilitate the coding process. They're going faster through that, hiring less employees, becoming more and more reliant on this technology. Not necessarily a bad thing, but when the technology is no longer available, what does that do from a business disruption perspective? Without Claude or developers going back to going a third as fast, what does that mean for your ability to ship code and meet those company growth targets that you've kind of set out with investors or the market or whatever else? So, when you're thinking about third-party cyber risk, maybe some of these things are standard risks that you've already got covered. Maybe others, like the kind of what happens to your business productivity, maybe not so well understood. And again, how do you quantify this? You can think about the business disruption, think about the fines, but I think in this one particularly around using AI to code, think about the additional operational cost to maintain the business objectives that you've been set. That could be quite a large short-term impact that you may or may not want to meet. Maybe it's revenue that would suffer as a result. Maybe it's a balance of the two things. So, when you're looking to quantify maybe a unique cyber risk on the kind of right-hand side of this, those are the kinds of things that you would be wanting to put together from an impact perspective. So why would you pull these from a quantitative? Because you could do all of that in a qualitative approach, put it on a nice heat map, and say, hey, I've kind of got this covered. I've got some likely risks, some high risks. I've got some reds and whatever. I think there's kind of four main reasons why I think quant is a better approach for looking at risk now in 2025. I think the first one, and probably the most important one that we get with our customers, is it aligns better to the language of the business. If you're talking about what is the cost of a cyber breach, what is the cost of doing something about a cyber breach, you can then talk in terms of what's the return on investment on spending money on cyber relative to other things, not just other risk management, but maybe growing your revenue gets you a lesser impact than actually avoiding the quantified losses from a cyber breach. And then suddenly business people who don't like to talk about the nitty-gritty of anything, let alone cyber risk that maybe they don't understand fully unless it's been in the headlines of a breach in the last month, suddenly start to get it, and you can have a proportionate conversation about allocation of resources. Not a difficult thing. I think the other thing is quantification allows you to sum all the risks. So as I say, if you're being looked at, what is our AI cyber risk as a horizontal slice, being able to look at the different facets of risk and sum them up in terms of a quantified basis is a lot better. I mean, if you do it qualitatively and you say, well, okay, we've got 3 red, 2 amber, and 4 green AI cyber risks, what does that give you? Brown. I haven't got a meme of a poo because it's a sensible business presentation, but you kind of get the point. I think also, subjective terms are highly open to misinterpretation. I think one of the biggest things that surprised me at Cydia is that, and we're doing a social experiment using interpretive Lego over on our booth today, is that when you ask someone how likely is likely, the range of answers for that is massive because everybody thinks something different. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, but when my likely is 60% and your likely is 80%, because this is really bad in your head, and you tell me that with the person with the resources that you need, that this is likely, I hear 60%, well, that's not that bad, we'll go and spend the money over there instead. So you're not aligning yourself effectively in terms of having a conversation on the same wavelength. And I think the other point, and I think a really important one about AI cyber risk in general at the moment, is that yeah, it's there. There are breaches there. It is important. It's arguably, most of the examples I've got could easily be covered as a subset of risks that you're already managing. But this might change. This might rise or fall over time. And if you're using a quant method to do that, you get a better comparable basis over time to be able to trend these things as they're getting better or worse. You need to break them out or not. 4 reasons that I would assert as to why doing quant on cyber risk is a better approach than some of the other options. So kind of running that through as a kind of worked example, how would we do that when we're doing the quant? So there's our customer-facing AI application compromise. Attackers are using attacks against the AI within our business-critical shop window application to compromise it and steal data. So what we're thinking about here in terms of the impact is, if they're stealing customer data, we're going to get fined. So there's a lot of good statistics around what's the value of fines proportionately on PII data. There's your basis of quant. It would disrupt your operations. So even when the data has been stolen, you're probably going to take your application down while you figure out how it's compromised and fix it. That could be a protracted period of time. So what is the revenue that you're collecting per day from the use of that application? That's a good basis of quant. If your application is just a chatbot and everybody relies on it for customer service, what would that do to the increased customer churn and the loss of revenue? Those would be the things that I would do around operational disruption. And then obviously you're going to have to fix the issue. Maybe you've got to find the issue and fix the issue. So the unit economics of the time of your engineers and third parties to fix it. Maybe it's all 3 of those things together to get a really good quantitative basis of what the impact of one of these things would be. And then on the likelihood side of things, it is fantastic if you want data on how likely cyber attacks to occur that is broadly accurate but not precise, which is kind of where we're going with this kind of thing. Go and look at every cyber vendor's annual report, because every vendor in every category in cybersecurity surveys all of its customer base and asks them if they've had breaches of the kind of thing that they're selling solutions for. So you can get state of ransomware, state of vulnerability compromise, general data breach stuff. Really good basis for likelihood in the absence of better data to rely on an externally verified source that's been surveyed across thousands of people. Shamelessly plug everybody's annual breach reports. They're great for this kind of thing. And then, there are statistics that we've used. Our view, looking at those kinds of reports, is that generally data breaches 5 to 25%. Pick the medium, skew it if you're a bigger target and you've got threat intelligence. Otherwise, AI is a subset. Very small chance of being breached today. Might change, might not, possibly go down as AI gets more secure, but you kind of get the idea. There's no right answer for your organization, but this is the approach I would follow. When you follow that approach, and you do that across all of the kind of AI risks that you want to break down, you can end up with something like this. So I've got a list of AI cyber risks. I've got an annualized loss against each of those risks, which means I can rank them in terms of importance and things that I do want to do about that or not. You could even layer all those AI cyber risks against all the other risks that you're tracking from a quantitative basis and go, do you know what, leadership team, these AI risks, I've got my head around it, here's what it looks like. But the risks number, they're all 20 and below in my top risk category. You want to think about the top 3, top 5. AI isn't it at the moment. It might change, I'm tracking it. But at the moment, it's ransomware and it's this and it's that and it's whatever, but it's not AI specifically, or it's AI as a subset. And then you can add them all up and you can look at an annualized loss curve because you can add up these kinds of things. You can look at the distribution of probability and impact of a loss. And you can also draw a nice dotted line with your business leadership that's their risk tolerance and say, well, actually, we're above, we're below the risk tolerance that you've got, so we don't need to spend any money. Or you said you want a 2% chance of losing more than $1 million on an annualized basis. We're way up here on a 25% chance. It's going to cost you $100,000 to do something about that, but it's going to actually reduce that by about £700,000 of potential material loss. That's a real return on investment from cybersecurity. So that's my unashamed pitch for quant and how you might put it around a problem like AI. If you're worried about these kinds of things, maybe you're not. I've got it all under control. Some of the questions that have come up in our consulting engagements with our clients around these kinds of risk categories, if you do nothing else and you don't believe in quant and you're super well served by other methods of GRC, ask yourself these kinds of questions. And if the answer is no, or I don't know, then maybe this is the motivator for you to go and then think about AI cyber risk as a specific subset of the things that you're being asked to look after. If you want to know more, or you're interested in quant, or you want to talk about in detail all of the other risks and see how we quantified them, we're doing 15-minute cyber risk assessments for anybody that wants to over on our booth, which is hot pink just over there. You can't miss it in a sea of blue branding. We're the only hot pink vendor here. Thank you very much for your time. And if anyone's got any easy questions, then I'm very happy to take them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that great presentation. I have some questions, but I'm not sure how easy they are for you.
I was only joking. You can ask me hard ones, just
okay,
promise
no
to know the
problem.
answer.
I think, first of all, how do you convert AI risk into impact score that a board can understand? And which quantification model work best when data is scarce, when data is limited?
Okay, so your question was, how do you convert
AI risk
into a quantified way that boards understand?
Impact score.
And what's the best method for doing that?
Yes, quantification method. And lastly,
Three questions.
What will be your simplest AI risk KPI that you could tell a small business to start tracking from next week?
What's the simplest AI risk KPI to start tracking next week?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you. Three good questions. So I think the first one, what's the best way to quantify AI cyber risk for the board? It's follow this or any other approach that gets you to a pounds, dollars, euros value for what you, on an annualized basis, if the risk materializes, what would be the pounds, dollars, euros cost of that risk? And that is, and not everybody's on the same page. I do think that is quantifying the impact on revenue, fines, additional operational costs, either individually or together to form the impact basis. That's the first one. Because if you put it in financial terms, all executive teams for companies or boards, their main job is to make sure that they are allocating the resources of the business most effectively to meet the objectives of a business, which is build shareholder value, hit growth targets, whatever. So if you can use the language of resource allocation between what is the benefit and what is the cost, and what is the return on that investment of doing something about it, you're on a level playing field then with the marketing director who wants more marketing money to generate more leads, to have a booth at Cyber Risk Europe, and what the value of that might be in potential revenue growth versus cyber cost. And if they want £1 million to generate 2 million more revenue, and you want £100,000 to reduce 2 million of operational costs, it's a pretty easy argument as to where you might put the allocation of resources to build value in a business. And what would be the methodology for doing that? I mean, there are lots of different ways to quantify cyber risk that are broadly the same. Some are more complex than others. I think adopt the one that works for you with the resources and the sophistication of what you need to get to that answer. I'm not a huge personal advocate of very complicated risk assessment methodologies where you are trying to create hundreds of risks that you've then got a list too long to manage, same as third-party risk. You're never going to go and do questionnaires on your suppliers, so pick a model and a way of segmenting it that makes it simple and easy for you to use. And also, I think when you're bringing lots of very detailed technical factors like vulnerability into the equation, you maybe don't end up with a better answer than a very simple, what's the business impact, how likely is it to happen, what do I need to spend money to do about it, how do I get to an ROI?
Thanks for your talk. So my question is around how do you deal with the hallucination risk around LLMs versus agentic? Because you could combine them to have a bigger hallucination. So what's the best way of quantifying that risk and mitigating that when you're going to agentic, which is essentially you're not sure where the true outcome is, because it's a probabilistic calculation, so it's not certain.
Yeah, thank you for a proper hard question. I think, honestly, I don't have an amazingly good answer for you on that. But I think like any other piece of technology that you're hooking up into a business process, the way I would be looking about going around quantifying that is I would be understanding the whole process. I would be understanding what is the role of agentic AI within that process. What is the opportunity for that to go astray? The more you focus the development time of agentic AI on building something from a foundational model that's fine-tuned well, that uses retrieval-augmented databases to keep it honest, for want of a better, simpler metaphor. If you're doing more work on the design and the implementation of that, then it's quite likely that the probability of that going wrong is far lower than I've just hooked up some random thing that I've just built last week as a prototype to OpenAI's API and let it rip. But to get that to a solid quantification basis, I would be leaning back on standard operational metrics that you should already be using on what happens if I'm plugging in third-party software and it has unintended consequences. How long would it be before I spotted it? What would be the cost of doing something about it? Well, I was unable to generate revenue from it. What would be the revenue impact? And I'd work it through like that.
Yeah, sorry. So there's obviously a rush to use AI, and a lot of what we might call level 1 or entry positions are being subsumed or overtaken by AI. So how do we address that human gap where people aren't getting the opportunity to do those level 1 jobs?
Yeah, I mean, that's a different question to cyber risk quantification, but I guess a couple of things that from personal opinion perspective, I think AI is brilliant at helping mid-level practitioners and better go faster when you broadly know what a good answer might look like and you need to get there quicker or in a more constructive way. I think the misnomer that I think now is becoming understood is it does not help basic people do a job that they don't already know how to do. And I think if your business is asking that of AI within your business, the risk of, again, operational failures through people using AI to do the wrong thing is, again, another business disruption, revenue-containing type event. And I would be pursuing that as the basis of quantifying that. But yeah, personally, I think if you don't already know broadly what the right answer might look like, then you're asking for trouble getting AI of any description to tell you what that might look like.
Vertically challenged, sorry. Thank you. I couldn't agree more about the quantification of risks. And I'm wondering if in your analysis of AI risk, you're talking about sort of racking and stacking the top risks, and is AI falling into the top risks? Have you done enough of these analyses yet to see where AI is percolating up in the level of risk? Because when I talk to most of our clients, they don't know their relative financial risk, strategic risk, cyber risk, AI risk, and I worry that we're have a lot of agita without necessarily knowing how.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So if your question is where does AI cyber risk rank against other risks that you're tracking? I think hopefully kind of one of the kind of non-overt vibes is there's a whole bunch of things in here that people are worried about a lot that are really a subset of risks that you should already be tracking. And what you should be doing is adjusting your current risk assessments to see whether AI is facilitating the impact and likelihood of those things occurring. I think one thing, if I had to pick one thing, because I'm not going to rank because it's too qualitative, if I had to pick one risk that you should be looking at above all others at the moment around AI, is it's the third-party risk of AI and not having enough understanding, enough governance, enough investigation as to how much has been done to make that AI in your third-party applications work in a way that's intended. And that's not just being vulnerable to prompt injection, which is probably the number one attacking AI risk at the moment, or command execution. It's where's the data going and being processed in the AI that sits behind the third-party application? This isn't AI in foundational models or in tier one application providers like Google and Microsoft. This is the AI in that cool new app that marketing want to use to produce AI presentations that no one's ever heard of, but is amazing. That's, it's no single one of those things. It's the aggregation of AI in all of those low tier applications and what it's doing. That's the one I would be looking at and maybe pulling out as a specific risk to be looking to try and quantify for your organization at the moment. Cool. Thank you very much indeed. And like I say, if you want to chat more or you want to come and see how we do quant, then please come to our hot pink shiny booth over there. Thank you.